Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher, and I've left it long enough now. I gave everybody a week after the last Q&A feedback video, which a lot of you loved. You also asked for more time so you could get your input in, and proper things could be upvoted rather than some random things. So I left it a week now, so hopefully that accommodates everybody who likes to watch the videos at the end of the week, or whatever it is you choose to do. I think 7 days is plenty of time. I've got some Bayonetta for you in the background. Really surprised at how hard / trial and error this game is. Actually reminded me very much of Dark Souls in the fact that you've got to kind of find out what happens and then go and do it. Which is not expected, but it's okay. I'm aware that all my deaths are actually normal. For the first playthrough, actually perfectly normal. So, mock away if you wish. I'm fine with it. Onwards then, Mr. Richard, long-time viewer of the channel, got plenty of upvotes regarding his ideas. And those were looking at a couple of things. So we had one, the discussion of world bosses and summonable bosses, something you do outside of raids in order to create the option to add a buff to your raid temporarily, so like a 2-hour buff. And we said we didn't want these to be boring stats like haste, multi-strike, well, although that's going away, crit, usual crap, but we wanted something like Wind Fury or the Wrath of Taragosa, something like that, or something for the healers, so that we could add a bonus to our raid in order to push forward and get the boss down. And the idea behind this is, one, if you've learnt the boss, but you're just missing out on that little edge, perhaps this little edge will do that. This should encourage raid progression far better, I think, than just Warforged and all that kind of nonsense. And then, also, on your farm raids, if you want to get down to 2 hours, you'll be trying to complete it in the time by buffing your DPS in some manner. And I think that would be kind of interesting. So, the feedback that Big Richard gave was like, well, depends how powerful this is, right? I mean, if it gives you something stupidly powerful, then that's no good. I was thinking around about 5%. Around about an overall average 5% DPS increase. Certainly not the 20 or 30 that Richard suggested. That would be crazy, because that would essentially give you, like, make the boss too easy so that next week you would probably still need the buff in order to farm it. The idea that I was looking for is if you're stuck on a boss, you can then go and use this buff in order to push you over the edge, but that should give you the confidence and the experience in order to kill it next week without it, while you're looking at the next boss, right? That's what I'm looking for. So about 5% buff would generally do that. And we have seen in the past examples, things like Ice Crown Citadel, when we gained a 5% buff, which was to all stats, I'm aware of that, the bosses started to fall over more regularly for many guilds. So a 5% push can be enough. The idea is that you don't get this buff, then start learning, right? That would be fucking idiotic. The idea is that you learnt the boss, you're almost there. So let's say you're doing something, let's take an easy example like the Butcher in High Mall, is that you're getting to like 5%, but it's just not quite enough. Things are starting to fall apart. Perhaps that 5% extra DPS or 5% extra healing for those guys in the last phase could actually just tilt the odds in your favor. And likelihood is that you move on, you get an extra loot and all that kind of stuff. Your raid progresses, and plus they've got confidence, is the likelihood is next time you'll actually kill that. What generally happens with most first kills in a guild is after you kill it once, you generally don't have much trouble with it next time because you've seen the fight through to its end. So that was my idea. Not 20 to 30%. That would be crazy. About 5% I think would be reasonable, because that I'm pulling that number from like ICC days, and that seemed to make the difference. In reference to guilds using split runs and stuff, we can never, ever, ever take into account that some people will find and abuse some hardcore way of gaming the system. Okay, so my idea was that if you used a 2-hour buff, that character would essentially be unable to benefit from that buff again for 7 days until the weekly reset. You can't benefit from it again. Okay, that means that the World First race goes relatively untouched, and in fact adds a new dynamic on when you're going to use your buff. A lot of World First guilds will be like, well, maybe we should save it for the next boss, but in fact, maybe this boss is actually harder. Maybe we need to push forward. Maybe we're not going to reach the last boss, and they can kind of work this in for this little 2-hour time period where they gain this extra benefit. Although I am aware that when we look at things like Wind Fury and the Wrath of Taragosa, is that potentially that causes like melee stacking, range stacking, and so on and so forth. Those are all issues to be content with, but I don't think those are issues that really affect the middle ground of guilds. I don't think that happens. At the very top end, sure, you might want to stack 18 casters all with the Wrath of Taragosa buff, but we can't balance around what the very, very top end are going to do. They're such a small minority. They're a really ridiculous minority compared to everybody else, and this really, in my opinion, would help the lower guilds keep progressing forward week on week. I think that's pretty cool. The catch-up mechanic was brought up. A lot of people don't understand why catch-up exists. And I specifically didn't really go against catch-up. It's existed since the Burning Crusade. And there's a good reason for it. Blizzard seemed to have checked into the numbers and the stats and found that a lot of people don't like coming to a game and not being able to, and basically being told you're not going to be able to see everything. Which, if you join towards like the last third of the game, it's unlikely you're going to be, if we had linear progression, it's very unlikely, if everything was remaining completely linear, is that you would be able to access things like Hellfire Citadel. Very unlikely you're going to be able to do that, because you're going to have to start with the blue gearing process, and then into the initial epics, then getting into High Mall, maybe doing challenge modes, then moving on to Blackrock Foundry or jumping guilds, and then eventually trying to get into Hellfire Citadel. For the vast majority of people, that's completely impossible, and they then get really put off. It's like, why would I buy the game now? I might as well wait till the next expansion, and that causes problems. Similarly, they would be enabled to access content like Tanaan Jungle. There is, Tanaan Jungle is reasonably difficult if you try and do it in greens, and I'm sure some of you have done that. You can work through it, but for, say, a new player, and you join the game, it's like, well, the catch-up mechanic is now Tanaan Jungle. Otherwise, you have to do, like, blues and then go through that other process I just discussed. Then people get really put off. It's already intimidating enough for players that they have to get to, like, a level 100, especially if they're a new player, which is why the 90 boost exists. I wish it came in when WoD launched, but there you go. So the catch-up mechanic actually makes total sense. I love the idea of the food with cool stuff. Okay, so the suggestion of Fellmouth came up, which gives you a different type of buff, which actually works out to a DPS increase, but it also does something cool for your character. You guys know I'm all over that. All over that. Absolutely all over that. I'm even into the idea that alchemists and professions and stuff, we're going to look at professions in a separate video, are able to create potions which do other different things inside of dungeon and raid environments, and even in battlegrounds. I think Arena needs to be kind of left alone, but I'm certainly all over flavor items rather than the flat buffs. I think flat buffs are so fucking boring. I have no idea why we're still maintaining this illusion that being raid buff makes you more powerful, because, as we said, some characters even carry like 2 of the buffs permanently, if not more, right? And it's just not interesting. You don't feel more powerful because you're almost that powerful anyway outside of a group. Adding in unique flavor items, and we'll always go back to it, but Wind Fury Totem was one of those items, as was Wrath of Air for various classes, which just gave you a boost of agility, but adding that into it and being significantly unique to each class is very cool. Homogenization has really drawn us away from that, and it's potentially up to professions and other things which allow us to play with our raid setups in some way. Getting like a capped alchemist isn't hard by any means, and doing all that kind of stuff is something that we could certainly look at. A lot of keys and attunement conversations came up. The attunement process can never be difficult. It really can't. And if you make it difficult, I think WildStar proved this. One of the biggest problems with WildStar wasn't that the game was hard, it's that it had quite a tedious attunement process. And it brought back exactly why attunements were removed. If you could see plenty of posts, and I did follow WildStar for quite a while to see what was going on with that game, as it was touted to be for the guys who really wanted to get back into the serious mode of raiding, is that attuning people was just a giant pain in the ass, and then to nerf the entire process several times in order to try and get people through it, but by then a lot of people had given up. It's one of those things, attunements sound good on paper, and probably when people are talking about it, they'll be all for it. In practice, a lot of people just don't like it. It's very much one of those situations where we're crying out for it. I want it. I want it. Attunements would be a great thing, and then they get presented with it and they just don't like it, and they don't want to do it. And you'll have players who you enjoy, good raiders, who just won't do it. They won't do it, and you can't understand when you ask the question, like, why aren't you doing this? And it'll be the usual question. There was no tanks available. Nobody wanted to do it with me. Have you asked? No, I was waiting for a group to start up. You guys will be fully aware of how many people will wait for somebody else to start a group rather than trying to start one themselves. Generally, those guys who also complain that, I can't get into a pre-made group. Well, why don't you make your own? And then they don't really answer that question. It's like, well, I don't. And the simple answer is, I can't be asked. I can't be fucking asked. I would rather somebody else do the work and I could tag along. And a lot of players are like that. And that's what makes the attunement process bad for you as well. Somebody who gets it all done and is like, right, I'm ready to go. You then look at Ghosty sat next to you. He's like, he's not even fucking started, and he's waiting for you to, or somebody else to really get it going. The RNG and loot system is going to be covered in an extra video, but I think that was pretty cool. Most of you were really quite happy with a lot of suggestions we made, and I think that kind of, came across pretty well. All right, I think you guys felt most of the ideas were pretty good. And other than that, the other question that came up I think was worth addressing in this video is the idea of the ratios of the multi-size dungeons I suggested. Some of you were interested in why it would not be called a raid because it had more than 5 people. That's not what a raid is. Although that in game that converts to a raid for more than 5, that's only because the dungeon limit is set to 5, right? What actually raiding is from like a game standpoint is a raid should be something with a lot of bosses generally and requires a lot of people to get through it and is going to be in there for an evening at least. A dungeon should probably be 2 or 3 bosses which are designed to die probably within 30 to 45 minutes. This is like a simple process. There's a very different way of comparing raids to dungeons. Mount Hyjal only had 5 bosses, but you certainly weren't intending to do that in 30 to 45 minutes, right? But if you join a dungeon, you do expect to do it within 30 to 45 minutes. There's a vast difference between dungeons and raids, and they've been designed that way. Some of you were seriously concerned about the ratios. I said like 2 tanks, 3 healers, whatever, or 2 healers. That could be tweaked in any way. The fact is, we don't have access to Blizzard's stats. They know exactly what the ratio is of people queuing for this stuff in terms of tank, healers, and DPS. Now, it could be, and I'm fully prepared to accept that the best ratio to provide the most efficient queue system is actually 1-1-3, which is our standard 5-man. 1 tank, 1 healer, and 3 DPS. That could be the most efficient way. Or it could be that 1 tank, 2 healers, and 5 DPS is actually the most efficient way. Or something along those lines. If we did have larger dungeons that were designed for, say, 10 people or 7 people or whatever it might be, I don't see a problem with only having 1 tanking there. You're just as likely to get a bad healer as you are a bad tank, and you can replace them. Let's face facts, you can replace them these days, and sure, it's frustrating, nobody's going to deny that, but it's frustrating in a 5-man where you still only have 1 tank. You get a really bad tank in a 5-man, it's just as frustrating, it's no big difference. So it's not something I'm really concerned about. They will know the exact ratios, and I also have to point out here, is the difference between the best ratio and the worst ratio. How big a difference is that in terms of general time wasted? Is it an extra 5 minutes, an extra 3 minutes, or is it an extra 40 minutes? We don't know. If we were to say something like, well, yeah, we're going to include 7 and 10-man dungeons, but that's going to double the queue time, then no, that's not acceptable. And I would be the first to say, no, we don't really want that. I don't want to be queuing an hour and 20 minutes to do a dungeon if I can do a 5-man in far quicker time. But if the difference is slightly less convenience, so let's say we're doing a 10-man dungeon and the queue is 30 minutes instead of 25, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. And a good way of actually making that choice would be something that's already in games. The drop-down menu is able to choose between heroic, normal, and so on, and you could also have it choose between 5-man, certain dungeons that are like 5-man and generally quicker, and larger dungeons, and you could even increase the item level in there if you want to be prepared for the slightly more inconvenience. Alright, so great suggestions there, guys. Overall, taken pretty well. Good stuff. Let's hope we see something interesting. We might see nothing at all, which would be the total fucking nightmare. We might see nothing at all, but let's wait and see. Alright, thank you very much. Bye-bye.